Guys, we're gonna be reacting to the steam engine locomotive water explosion in Germany. So let's check it out.
In the last video, I already refreshed everybody about the state of Germany at this point in time. This was in 1977, and believe me, the Berlin Wall was still a thing, and it was a much bigger thing, and things were not fun for anybody. We've already gone over this. I won't bore you with the details. Again, check the last video if you want more on that. But the point is, if you were behind the Iron Curtain, or even next to it, it really wasn't a fun time to be around. The incident in question did happen in East Germany, and it was on the 27th of November of 1977. It involved express train D562 that was at that time being pulled towards Berlin. And it was being pulled by a DR-03 number 121 at that point. Now the 03s were a German-built steam locomotive, and they were actually very, very good. They were built as part of the standardization plan that Germany did all the way back in the 30s. And these locomotives were one of the mainstays when it came to German passenger service. They were large, with a 462 wheel arrangement, which technically would make them Pacific types. But since it's in Germany, they probably didn't call them that. I don't know. Ask them. I have no idea. But these were good locomotives, and that's part of the reason they were still being used in East Germany well into the 70s, even though they were originally built in 1930. On board was a crew of two, the driver as well as the stoker, and both men were experienced, but apparently that day they got their calculations wrong for whatever reason, and the locomotive ran out of water. Now you may recognize this as being incredibly dangerous, however, the 03s were equipped with a safety feature that prevented the exact kind of horrific repercussions of running low on water from occurring, namely, what's called a melting plug, sometimes called a fusible plug. It's a plug in the boiler near the firebox that has a lower melting point compared to the rest of the locomotive. The result is that if the temperature in the boiler gets too high, to dangerous levels, this plug will melt first, causing the steam to be released into the firebox, extinguishing the source of heat and allowing the locomotive to cool down. It's actually a very clever safety measure, though not all steam locomotives were equipped with it. However, this one was, and that's why 121 did not explode that day. Instead, it just stopped, because they ran out of water, the melting plugs went out, and without the melting plugs you can't actually turn the steam locomotive back on without replacing them. The driver was forced to get on the radio and report the incident to his superiors, which, this is in Soviet territory, and no matter where you worked, expectations were very high for the workers involved. And according to my sources, the driver was apparently deeply concerned about his timetable at this point, which is possibly why he and the stoker neglected to put water in the locomotive. And this would not be the first time they did it that day. Because the express was stranded and they had to get it out of there, the railway sent a Series 118 diesel locomotive to tow the steam engine as well as the rest of the train all the way to Berlin. These are also known as DR Class V180, and they are very, very good German diesels. They were built in the 60s and weren't retired till 1995, some of which are still in running condition. But the diesel would not be responsible for taking the train on its return trip. It was just meant to get the express as well as 121 all the way to Berlin so the engine could undergo basic maintenance and be replaced with another steam locomotive for the second half of the journey. Enter DR 011516. 1516 was a DRG Class 01, sometimes called a BR01. And actually the 03s were based directly on the 01s. They were also 462 Pacifics, and the main difference between 03s and 01s is that 03s were designed to be a little bit lighter so they could operate on different rails. But other than that, there was very little difference between the two and used mostly the same parts. Again, standardization was a major factor when it came to designing these steam locomotives in the first place. Several 01s are actually still in running condition over in Germany even to this day. Much like the 03s, they're very nice locomotives. The crew of 121 transitioned over to 1516 to take the express back the way they came. Now apparently they were feeling incredibly pressured by the superiors because they started making significant cuts to basic common sense actually, in order to make up the time. See, prior to a locomotive leaving a main station, it's not unusual to top off both the coal and the water. Both the driver and the stoker convinced the workers involved that they only need to top off the coal and don't bother with the water tanks, even though they told their dispatch office that both had been filled up. Oh yes, you see what's coming. As they started their journey, the crew actually asked to make a water stop at Wittenberg. but this was denied by their superiors, which, on one hand, rude, but on the other hand, they had just told them that they topped off water in Berlin, so they shouldn't have needed to get more water in Wittenberg. But they didn't get water in Berlin. The superiors didn't know that, though. So instead they had to move forward onto Bitterfeld, which was actually a scheduled stop on the route, and at that point they probably would have been able to get water, except for one itsy-bitsy little problem. Now you may be wondering, well, if 121 had those melting plugs, does 1516 not? Well, it does, actually. They were both equipped with them. So yes, the melting plugs should have prevented yet another steam explosion from occurring. However, in this case, unbeknownst to the maintenance crews that had just worked on 1516, the melting plugs were covered in limescale, which is a hard, chalky mineral deposit that can sometimes build up in unpurified water. The problem was the limescale was bad enough that it actually isolated the plugs from the rest of the boiler enough that even at the higher heat that the boiler was operating, as in danger levels, the plugs did not melt. As 1516 approached the Bitterfeld station, it went down a grade and then onto a level surface. As a result, what little water was in the boiler started sloshing around, allowing the top of the firebox, the crown sheet, to become dry and overheated. And when the water slashed back on top of it, well...
What happened? Oh my fucking
Just as
God.
1516 came to a stop at that platform, which by some sources say was packed with at least 200 people, the boiler went off. The locomotive's cab was ripped to shreds, and the boiler was shot forwards. Burning coal and debris was thrown everywhere. The boiler landed 40 meters, or 132 feet, past the leading end of the locomotive's frame. And as it landed, it was so hot that it actually welded itself to the track. A total of 9 people were killed in this accident, 7 on the platform, as well as the locomotive's 2 crew members. Fortunately, no one in the express was harmed, and given there were 200 people on the platform, it could have been a lot worse. Another 45 survived but were injured. The investigation afterwards was a closely guarded secret by the government. They didn't like accidents like this getting out, which is weird because it's not like the Western countries hadn't suffered steam explosions at this point, though this was in 1977 and you'd think by that point we'd learned how to prevent them. Plus, this locomotive was equipped with melting plugs that should have prevented this exact kind of thing from happening. But when they did their investigation, they discovered the limescale buildup. The main issue is that this locomotive was just in maintenance at Meiningen, so there was no reason why this sort of thing should have been overlooked. This, in combination with the crew's desperate need to make up for lost time, meant that an accident like this was probably inevitable.
Okay.
On one hand, you could fault the crew for lying to their superiors, but on the other hand, their superiors were Soviets, and a major part of the reason why people were fleeing from the Soviet Union was because they were living in a constant state of fear. It's not unreasonable to think that the driver and stoker were absolutely terrified at the punishment they would receive just for being late, and so took a really dumb risk trying to save their own skins. Additionally, neither of them would have had any reason to think the melting plugs wouldn't have gone off if they pushed the locomotive too hard. After all, it had just happened to them earlier in the day. I mean, you'd think that would make them be more careful, but also they knew the safeties were intact, so an explosion was unlikely. Additionally, it was never clarified by the local government why the locomotive did not have those melting plugs fixed, but the common theory goes that 1516 was a rush order into the shops because they wanted it back in service as soon as possible. Either way, 9 people were killed because of this. And I'd say we learned a valuable lesson at this point, but the Gettysburg Railway had one in the 90s, so that was great too. Until next time, this is Darkness.
Okay, guys, this was the video. So, bye and have a good day.